we are. We're the underdogs.
All right, so today's Super Bowl Sunday, so I figured I had to start with this. This is one of my favorite Super Bowl stories ever, and you might think it's great, you might think it's bad, but that's okay. We're in a series talking about underdogs. We're talking about comebacks, and for Israel, where we left off last week, the glory has departed from Israel, right? They've lost the Ark of the Lord, and everyone's looking around like, it's over, we're done, right? And that's pretty much the exact situation, obviously a little bit different circumstances and different consequences that the New England Patriots found themselves in against the Atlanta Falcons in Super Bowl 51. I don't know if any of you watched Super Bowl 51. Most people probably turned it off in the third quarter because the Patriots found themselves with what everybody pretty much considers the best quarterback of all time, who, by the way, was an underdog himself as a 6th round draft pick. But they find themselves losing to the Atlanta Falcons 28-3. The Falcons have the ball in the fourth quarter. Everybody's turning the game off at this point. Pretty much everybody's saying that Matt Ryan's going to be the MVP. Falcons had one of the best offenses in the NFL that time. And sure enough, bit by bit, New England claws their way back. They get a sack fumble on Matt Ryan. And then, again, just bit by bit, things just start to go New England's way. And they find themselves beating the Atlanta Falcons 34-28. And people have said that that is the greatest comeback in Super Bowl history. They held this great offense with 0 points, and then if you actually watch the game, you'll see there's crazy plays happening left and right. Julian Edelman, the receiver for the Patriots, caught this crazy pass out of nowhere to put them in scoring range, should have been intercepted, and history has revealed itself that Brady is for sure probably the best quarterback ever. So had to tell that story because it's kind of where Israel leaves off. They're basically looking around like, nothing is going their way. The last words of chapter 4 say this: the glory has departed from Israel, for the Ark of God has been captured. And so this morning we're going to be in Samuel chapter 5. Has to be one of the best stories in all of the scriptures. So let's just jump right into it. Samuel 5, beginning with verse 1, it says this: after the Philistines captured the Ark of God, they took it from the battleground at Ebenezer to the town of Ashdod. They carried the Ark of God into the temple of Dagon and placed it beside an idol of Dagon. Now Israel is at an all-time low. The Philistines have absolutely destroyed them in battle. Last week we learned that they lost 34,000 soldiers and the Ark of God had been captured. Eric spoke last week about Israel's plan to take the Ark into the battlefield, and the reason why is because in their minds this basically guaranteed them that they were going to win. In fact, even the Philistines were worried that they were going to lose this battle because they knew what the God of Israel had done to Egypt in the past. And whenever war broke out between two colonies, or whatever you want to call them, countries, whenever war broke out, most people saw that as it was a battle between the gods of those people. And so if Israel was to win, then Yahweh, or the God of Israel, would have been seen as more powerful than the God of the Philistines, Dagon. However, when the Philistines defeated Israel and captured the Ark of God, in their minds, they had captured Israel's God, which is why Israel even themselves say that where has the glory gone? The glory has left Israel because God is, in their minds, gone. They believed the God that they worshiped, Dagon, was more powerful than Yahweh, and in their minds they had just proved it. So what do you do whenever you win? What do you do whenever you win a big game? Well, you celebrate, of course, you brag. Oftentimes, you become disrespectful to the other team, and you rub it in a little bit. And the Philistines are literally doing just that. They bring the Ark of God, which quick side note on that, the Ark of God was basically a pure gold-covered wooden chest with an elaborate lid called the mercy seat. In it, there were two stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, and it was a symbol of God's presence with Israel. If you remember remember from last week, though, you might remember that Israel's response to losing the ark was actually way more severe than them losing even their loved ones, even their sons, even their husbands. They responded way more severely to the fact that the ark was gone, not necessarily the fact that they had lost people that were loved ones in their life. It wasn't just that the Philistines believed that God had been captured. The Israelites also believed that their God had just been defeated. And so to rub it in a little bit, to humiliate Israel's God, the Philistines set the ark of God into the temple of Dagon, and they set it next to Dagon. Now this would be kind of like another football memory of mine. The 49ers played the Dallas Cowboys back in the Cowboys' house, and the Cowboys' home turf, and while the 49ers were dominating, they end up scoring a touchdown. One of the 49ers wide receivers, after scoring this touchdown, ran to the middle of the field and literally started dancing on the Cowboys logo. This act was so disrespectful to the Dallas Cowboys that they literally broke out in a massive fight. Multiple players were ejected, and you cannot tolerate disrespect in another person. This makes sense, right? I mean, they were literally mocking the Israelites. The Philistines are rubbing it in. Not only did they kill 34,000 of Israeli soldiers, but they literally took the most sacred piece of Israel and they set it next to their idol. They set it next to their false god. They taunted the God of Israel, which is the same God that literally created the Philistines. The Philistines worshiped a god by the name of Dagon, who they basically believed had given them victory in this battle. And also they believed that he had given them an abundance of food. Dagon could also be known as the god of grain, and is actually connected to a future god you might know by the name of Baal. Dagon is considered to be the father of Baal. And so here we sit. The glory has left God's people. The glory has left Israel. The nation is absolutely devastated. They're hopeless, and they truly don't have anywhere that they can turn. The one thing that they put their hope in, the most sacred piece of their history, had been captured, and it's now in the temple of Dagon. How's God going to respond? Well, let's take a look here at verse 3, one of the best verses in all of Scripture. But when the citizens of Ashdod went to see it the next morning, Dagon had fallen with his face to the ground in front of the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and they put him in his place again. As I always say, Dagon got shamed. He got absolutely shamed. I mean, can you picture this scene? A guy who works at the temple walks in, starts turning on the lights, maybe makes himself some coffee, checks his email. He walks into the sanctuary, and then bam, he finds his god Dagon face down in reverence of the ark of God that they had just captured. I mean, they come into the temple to find their God bowing down before the ark of the God of Israel. The same God they thought they had defeated was now defeating their God right in front of their eyes. I mean, what do you think is going through their minds when they come into the temple to find all of this is ruined? I mean, they put everything into this God, right? Dagon's their hope. In Dagon they trust. And there he is, shamed, face down on the ground before the God of Israel. I imagine they tried to find an excuse for this, any reason to disprove what they knew in their hearts was happening. Maybe they said something like, was there an earthquake last night that we didn't know about? Man, Pastor, you must have shut the doors to the temple pretty hard last night. You know what? I bet somebody, maybe a Jew snuck in and did all this just to mess with us. Those sore losers from Israel. So what did the Philistines do? Well, they put him back in his place, right? So let's take a look here at what happens next. But the following morning when they rose, because again, they think it's just fluke probably. The following morning when they rose, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. His head and hands had been broken off and were lying on the threshold. Only his body remained. That is why to this day, neither priests of Dagon nor any others who enter Dagon's temple at Ashdod step on this threshold. He got shamed again. He got shamed a second time. They come back the next morning, and not only is he down again, but this time his head and hands are broken off, which symbolizes that Dagon is completely powerless before the ark of the Lord. The priests have to be looking at each other going like, what in the world just happened? Who is this God of Israel? And I bet as chills started to run down their spines, the memory of what happened to Egypt when they went against the God of Israel started to come into focus. God just showed Dagon, and I hope that he shows all of us, that you just don't mess with God. Their God was face down before the ark. What a powerful moment in the big picture of the battle of the gods. Let me just remind everybody this morning that there is coming a day when every knee is going to bow and every tongue is going to confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. We can try to push him away. We can try to hide from him. We can try to negotiate the terms. But the bottom line is, God shows us here, he's God. And he's more powerful than anything else. Regardless of what Israel does, regardless of what the Philistines do, regardless of what I do, God is God, and I want to be very clear about this. This is his story. The Bible is God's story. We're part of God's story. God's not part of our story. It's the other way around. God's in charge, we're not, and he shows us here in this moment. There might be moments where as Christians in our lives, I know that I've been through them, I'm sure that you have, where we feel like no matter where we turn, we are losing almost at every turn. It seems like nothing can go our way. The key for us is the same as the key for the people of Israel. See, Israel put their faith in God the idol, not God. What we want to do is we want to put our trust in the one true God, the God of Israel. And whether we trust God or not, remember, it's not going to change the fact that God is who he says he is. We're the ones that have to change, not God. It's up to us to place our hope in him, not our man-made idols, not our traditions, not our bank accounts, not our 5-step plan, because we cannot manipulate, control, or negotiate with God. So let's look at how the Philistines respond to this. Very interesting response in verse 6. Then the Lord's heavy hand struck the people of Ashdod and the nearby villages with a plague of tumors. Sound familiar? When the people realized what was happening, they cried out, "We can't keep the ark of the God of Israel here any longer. He is against us. We will all be destroyed along with Dagon our God." So they called together the rulers of the Philistine towns and asked, "What should we do with the ark of the God of Israel?" The shame continued, and God's hand was heavy on these people. But you know what's interesting about the Philistines' response? They didn't give up on their own God. Their man-made false idol, even in the midst of the obvious, God had literally shown them that he's more powerful than their God, that he is God Almighty, that Dagon worships him. Isn't that what most people do? We encounter people who don't see God as God, and then when things start to point to God's reality, they don't even consider that it could be God. They knew the God of Israel was doing this, and yet they kept digging their heels in. They kept going down this path. It's not even that they were weighing their options, right? In fact, they never even considered turning to the God of Israel and worshiping him. They did what most of us do, which is they began to craft a plan to edge God out. They began to craft a plan to edge God out. God's hand is heavy on us and our God. We've got to get away from him because he's afflicting us and our God. Really, you need to protect your God from this God. That doesn't sound like God. So what shall we do? Let's look at verse 9. The rulers discussed it and replied, "Move it to the town of Gath." So they moved the ark of the God of Israel to Gath, but when the ark arrived at Gath, the Lord's heavy hand fell on its men, young and old. He struck them with the plague of tumors, and there was a great panic. And then listen to this, verse 10. So they sent the ark of God to the town of Ekron, but when the people of Ekron saw it coming, they literally cried out, "They are bringing the ark of the God of Israel here to kill us too." I mean, they're bringing the ark of God of Israel to kill us too. The reputation of God preceded him. I mean, can you imagine this? They're shuffling this chest around from town to town. Everywhere it goes, it's afflicting people. People are so scared of this thing. They're literally scared to death of the Ark of the Lord. And what's funny about this and heartbreaking at the same time is the Philistines, non-believers, had more reverence for the God of Israel than the people of Israel did. Philistines, non-believers, had more reverence, had more respect, had more healthy fear of God than the people of Israel did. If you think it's enough to believe in God, you might be wrong. Why was Israel in this mess to begin with? They sinned, their rebellion. You can say whatever you want, but the bottom line is, Judges sums it up very nicely. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. They were following themselves, not following God. The bottom line is, Israel was in this mess because they weren't fearing God. They weren't following God. They didn't respect God. In fact, they tried to manipulate God. Israel was chosen to be God's people, but they weren't living like it. And so what happened? Tragedy happened. Church, if we think it's just enough to be in God's house and to be on God's team and not follow him and not respect him and not take all of this very seriously, I think that we're sorely mistaken. The Philistines respected Israel's God more than they did. And isn't that true today? I mean, convenience and comfort has caused complacency in the church. I was talking with one of the members of our growth group this past week. They said something about our church that I really hadn't thought that much about, but she's totally right. They said this church has a fire and a passion. It's like we're on a mission together. It's like we're trying to do something. It shows in how we go after people. We introduce ourselves. We get to know one another. And I'm trying to be like that myself because, and key on this right here, I can't tell you how painful it is to be in the house of God and to feel completely alone. To go through the ups and downs, the struggles of this life, completely unseen. That's convenience, that's complacency, and that's corruption. Convenience and comfort caused Israel to drift from what got them there in the first place. If we're not careful, the same thing is going to happen to us. The things that got us here to the right now is relationships, is passion, is love, is encouraging one another. And if we don't keep those things at the forefront, then we're going to slip. So I pray that you'll take our group seriously because they absolutely are everything that we do. Our passion and our fire comes from this mission to go after people, to know them, to love them like Jesus first loved us. It's not just enough to come to church and to believe it. As I was reading this passage this week, I don't know why, but the words of James 2 just echoed in my head. James 2:19 says this. He says, "You believe that there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder." Even the demons believe that and shudder. Even the Philistines knew. Even the Philistines knew that the God of Israel was a God of power. They couldn't deny it. And so what did they do? Verse 11, take a look. The people summoned the Philistine rulers again and begged them, "Please send the ark of the God of Israel back to its own country, or it will kill us all." For the deadly plague from God had already begun, and a great fear was sweeping across the town. Those who did not die were afflicted with tumors, and the cry from the town rose to heaven. The cry from the town rose to heaven, which is exactly what was happening back in Egypt. The Philistines knew that they couldn't mess with the God of Israel. And as a last chance hope, they decided what they were going to do was get rid of it. Not turn to it, not worship it, not follow, but get rid of it. Get it out of here. Let it go back to Israel. And so they crafted this elaborate plan to do this, or to let it go back to its place in Samuel 6. Let's take a look at verse 1. It says, "The ark of the Lord remained in Philistine territory 7 months in all. Then the Philistines called their priests and diviners and asked them, 'What should we do about the ark of the Lord? Tell us how to return it to its own country. Send the ark of the God of Israel back with a gift. Send a guilt offering so the plague will stop. Then if you are healed, you will know it was his hand that caused the plague.'" I think it's interesting that they decide they're going to send a guilt offering because they themselves know that they are guilty. They know they're in the wrong and they're still going downhill. What sort of guilt offering should we send? And they were told, since the plague had struck both of you and your 5 rulers, make 5 gold tumors and 5 gold rats, just like those that have ravaged your land. People would say that this can point to the fact that the plagues that was inflicted upon the Philistines could have possibly been the bubonic plague. That's the symbolization for the rats right there. Make these things to show honor to the God of Israel. What? Make these things to show honor to the God of Israel. Perhaps then he will stop afflicting you and your gods and your land. Don't be stubborn and rebellious as Pharaoh and the Egyptians were. By the time God was finished with them, they were eager to let Israel go. Again, Israel's God reputation preceded it. Now build a new cart, find 2 cows that have just given birth to calves. Make sure the cows have never been yoked to a cart. Hitch the cows to the cart. Never been yoked to a cart. What that basically means is they wouldn't know where they were going. There's no possible way the cattle could have known where to go. Okay, hitch the cows to the cart, but shut the calves away from them in a pen. Put the ark of the Lord on the cart. So picture this: it's a cart, 2 cows, and an ark, right? The wooden chest. And beside it, place a chest containing their guilt offering, the gold rats, the gold tumors that you're sending as a guilt offering. Then, keyword, let the cows go wherever they want to go. Let them do whatever they want to do. They're putting God to the test. Verse 9 says this: if they cross the border of our land and go to Beth Shemesh, we will know it was the Lord. Beth Shemesh, Israeli territory. So if the cart goes there, then we're going to know it was the God of Israel that was messing with us, right? We will know that it was the Lord who brought this great disaster upon us. If they don't, we will know that it was not his hand that has caused the plague. It came simply by chance. They're putting the God of Israel to the test again. And what's interesting is there's moments in time when you put God to the test and he wins the test. The fact that they're even considering and talking about giving glory to Israel's God, they are way beyond what they were back in verse 1. Bring God into Dagon, set it beside Dagon. We won. Israel's in shambles. We've done it. And now they're like, let's get this God out of here. Let's get rid of this thing. We've got to give glory to it. We don't even know what to do, right? They're scrambling. They're scared to death. And what we're seeing in the passage is a panic plan. And we do that ourselves, right? God, if you love me, heal this person. God, if you do this, right? And that's what they're doing. The memory of what happened to Egypt when they went against God is echoing in their minds. They know that they can't mess with him, but instead of turning to Yahweh, instead of turning and worshiping the God of Israel, they push him away. They push him away because they think if we can just get away from God, we're going to be fine. They also put God to the test. They craft a plan to see if this really is the God of Israel that's doing this to them. So let's take a look at how God responds in verse 10. This is actually probably my favorite piece of this passage. So these instructions were carried out. 2 cows were hitched to the cart, and their newborn calves were shut up in a pen. Then the ark of the Lord and the chest containing the gold rats and gold tumors were placed on the cart. So you have 2 cows that are driving this or that are on it, and then you've got the ark, and that's it. And then the guilt offering, okay? Sure enough, 12 is so key. Sure enough, without veering off in other directions, the cows went straight along the road toward Beth Shemesh, Israeli territory. Lowing as they went, the Philistine rulers followed them as far as the borders of Beth Shemesh, or Israel. And then the people of Beth Shemesh were harvesting wheat in the valley, and when they saw the ark, they were overjoyed. Stop there. The ark of God has returned to its people. But I want to key in on verse 12. Sure enough, without veering off in other directions, the cows went straight along the road toward Israeli territory. How could that have happened? The answer is God. Remember, the ark of God is a chest. So how in the world can a chest drive a cart? 2 cows that have never done this before. The only answer is God. God once again showed the Philistines that he is God. He also shows us that he is our God. And so what did the Philistines do? Such a key. Nothing. They went back. They went back to worshiping Dagon. They went back to doing things the way they've always done them, and they never once considered to turn to Yahweh. We've seen that before, haven't we? I mean, God has revealed himself over and over again to people that you've probably tried to minister to who simply would rather push him out of their life. They would rather push him out of this scenario. They manipulate God. They try to control God. They try to keep God in a box. And what God teaches us today is that he can't be kept in a box. Because you see, God, over and over again in this story, gave them a choice. Even the demons believe and shudder. That is a crazy verse. They know, right? But it's not enough to just know. We're called to follow. Now, I was talking with my wife about this passage, and I was, geeking out, telling her everything that I had learned and studied and all the pieces of the puzzle. And she looks back at me, as my wife typically does, and in about 5 words cuts to the chase. She goes, "So what's the point? It's all good, but what's the point? What's the takeaway from all of this?" The text says that Israel is overwhelmed with joy. Of course they are. The ark, the glory's back, right? The ark has returned to Israel. But is that the point? We're in a series called Underdogs, and we're looking at how God uses people that you might not expect. God used oppression from non-believers to wake up his believers. God used oppression, circumstances caused by non-believers to wake up his believers. What's going to happen in the next coming chapters is Israel is going to have some form of a revival. Their faith is going to be renewed a little bit. And God reminded his people and all of us that we can't control or manipulate God to do what we want when we want, because we're part of his story. But even in the depths of Israel's despair, even after the glory has departed from Israel, God still chose to come back to his people. The cart with the ark of the Lord went straight to Israel. Didn't go any other direction. It went straight, beelined, right towards his people. God didn't waver to the right or the left. As people who follow God, I think we can all agree that oftentimes we waver. We go this way or that way. We follow this or that. Israel deserved to lose here. They deserved it. Israel didn't even do anything to get the ark back in the first place. I don't even think they repented. The text doesn't say that they did. They didn't repent. Yet, listen to this, God still chose to show up. So what's the point? While Israel was still in shambles, God went to them. While Israel was still in shambles, God went to them. Because we follow a God that doesn't quit on his people. We're about to head into a time of communion together. And communion is where we remember that Jesus Christ didn't waver either. We remember that Jesus came to earth as God with us. He lived a perfect life. He died as a sacrifice for our sins, and he was raised to life overcoming death. Jesus, just like with Israel, while we were still sinners, Jesus Christ died for us.